the reproductive system in chapter 25. And then chapter 26 they call like development and inheritance or something like that. And the truth is that chapter 26, we could spend an entire course talking about all that stuff because that's the science of embryology, how the human develops from a single cell into a complicated organism. And then it goes way into genetics, which is a whole other course in and of itself. So chapter 25 is all testable material. Chapter 26, I've just picked out a couple of topics that we're going to talk about, and the rest of that is not. So in the PowerPoint set for this topic, I put them together, 25 and 26. In here, for this class, we have 3 days. So we're going to basically talk about male, female, and then some development stuff. Yes?
It's kind of off topic. During the test, can you put the chapter questions together instead of mixing them up?
What do you mean?
Like for the urinary system, have all those questions together and then have...
Oh, in one block?
Yes.
I'll have to look to see. I think so.
Okay.
I think so. So that's the preference. You'd rather have them that way than
Yeah,
mixed up.
because I remember like the last test you had, it was all mixed up.
Yeah, because I use a randomizer.
Yeah, I don't like that. That's crappy.
I'll see, and I haven't decided if I'm going to exam 3 isn't built yet, but I will keep that in mind. Okay?
Thank you.
All right, so anyway, we're going to talk about male system, we're going to talk about female system, and then we're going to talk about just a few topics about development, like how the placenta forms and that kind of thing. All right, so first up, male system. The overview, we're going to talk about each of these, but classic summary slide. So in both the male and the female, the reproductive system, we divide it into basically these 3 categories. So the gonads are where the gametes are produced. Gametes are the cells that can combine with a cell from the other gender to form an offspring. So we're going to talk about what a gamete is. But essentially, the gonads are where the gamete is produced. So in the male, the gamete is the sperm. In the female, the gamete is the ovum. So those are the gonads. So for the male, it's testes. Then we have the external genitalia. That's the parts of the reproductive tract that you can see. And then we have the accessory organs. And accessory organs don't produce gametes, and but without them, the reproductive system can't function. So, for example, in the male, we have the accessory organs are the Ductus deferens, which carry the sperm from the testes, the seminal glands, the prostate gland, and the bulbourethral glands, which all contribute secretions to the semen. And then we have the urethra and epididymis. And we'll see a similar diagram when we get to the female, where we have gonads, external genitalia, and then accessory organs. So those are sort of the 3. And when we look at the anatomy here, so this is a sagittal section, so down the midline. And we have, and I said this anatomy is all need to know. This is a pretty good diagram. And the reproductive system is actually pretty easy to see in the sagittal section for both male and female. So you'll see it's kind of a weird cut, but you can see everything that way. All right, so we have the scrotum here with the testes inside. Just behind the testes are the epididymis. We're going to talk about what those do here in a minute. The epididymis is connected to the urethra, which is right here, by this long sweeping arc. That's the ductus deferens, which follows the spermatic cord up, which we'll see a better picture of in a minute. It comes around here, joins with the seminal vesicle here, and then ultimately empties into the urethra here. So we have a passage through the prostate gland. And then here's the bladder that we talked about last unit, or not last unit, the unit before. Here's the urethra that comes down through. This ball-shaped gland here, that's the prostate gland, right? So it also contributes secretions to the urethra. And let's see, prostate gland. This pathway for semen through the prostate gland before it joins with the urethra, we call that the ejaculatory duct. So that's here. So there's sort of two paths through the prostate, the ejaculatory duct and then the urethra with coming from the bladder. And let's see. Okay, that's all on that one, I think. Okay. So in order to understand the anatomy of the testes, you have to understand that they don't start where they end up. So the ovary and the testes actually begin development in the same place. And that's because they essentially start from the same part of the embryo. So early in fetal development, in the embryonic state, so you're talking about the first trimester here, the testes is in the posterior abdominal wall. It's actually quite near to where the kidneys are at that time. So, and the testes is connected to the bottom part of the scrotum by this band of connective tissue. All right? So this is early on. This is at 2 months of development. So our scale here is, 5 millimeters. So this is a very tiny, embryos are very tiny. But that's where all the important development happens. Okay, so this connective tissue band. So as the embryo and grows, this connective tissue band does not. So essentially, the testes is pulled towards the scrotum because the rest of the embryo is getting larger, but this band is staying the same size. So you can either think of it as the testes is getting pulled or the baby is growing away from it. Okay? And then late in fetal development, so that's kind of where the testes stays. It stays sort of in the anterior part of the abdomen, right? And then in the last trimester, it moves its last time, or at least if everything goes correctly. And that is as the baby, the male child, starts producing male hormones, testosterone in particular, this connective tissue band shrinks. And as it shrinks, it pulls the testes down into the scrotum, and then after birth, that is the normal placement. So as we'll see here in a minute, because the testes doesn't start where it ends up, it has this path that it took from here down to here, kind of remains even in the adult. So we call that the inguinal canal. I'll show you that in a minute. But so this is an important idea that the testes descend is the common term for it shortly before birth, because oftentimes it doesn't quite work out perfectly. A very common finding in a newborn male is that one or both of the testes will not be in the scrotum. And of course that freaks parents out. Almost always, the testes is just fine. It didn't finish its journey down into the scrotum. So typically the urologist will watch the child for about 3 months, and if it still has not come down, then they'll do a simple surgical procedure where they'll sort of pull it down and then suture it into the scrotum so that it doesn't go back up. So just a common thing to know about, and it all comes from this sort of journey that has to be made. So do you see this long path right here? That's part of the journey. So as the testes came out of the abdomen, it came out about here, and then it makes its way down what we call the inguinal canal to its final resting place, which is in the scrotum. So the path that the ductus deferens take up to the urethra, that sort of follows the path that the testes cross as they're developing in the embryo and then later on in the fetus. All right. So again, this is a good anatomy picture. Okay, so here's the inguinal ligament. The inguinal ligament is essentially the fold between the upper thigh and the trunk, right? So they kind of make a V. The two inguinal ligaments make a V. So that's here. Towards the midline, there's a break in the fascia that we call the superficial inguinal ring, which is right here. This is one of the spots where hernias can happen. A hernia is where the contents of the abdomen are pushing out somewhere they don't belong. So one version of a hernia, it happens at the umbilicus, where it sort of pooches out. You see that in babies sometimes. And then the common hernia that men get from heavy lifting is where this superficial inguinal ring has some abdominal contents that are sort of pushing out there. So that's that. It's there because that's the hole, so to speak, that the testes pass through on its way to the scrotum. So we have our superficial inguinal ring. We have it on both sides, but this is more superficial than this is over here. All right. The testes is surrounded by a sort of flat muscle called the cremaster muscle. And the cremaster muscle can either pull the testes up towards the body, that's when it contracts, or when it relaxes, the testes fall further away from the body. And there's a reason for that. Sperm production occurs best at slightly lower than body temperature. So the reason that the scrotum evolved in the first place was to get the testes outside of the heat of the body, so to speak, because of that temperature differential. So the cremaster muscle essentially stabilizes the temperature of the testes by either bringing them in closer to the warm body or letting them out further. Because optimal sperm production temperature is like 90 degrees as opposed to 90.6 degrees in Fahrenheit scale. Okay, so cremaster muscle. And then on this side, the cremaster has been removed so we can see the contents here. So we have the testes right here. We have the epididymis on top, which stores sperm. More on that in a minute. And then we have this bundle of stuff here that we call the spermatic cord. So we have the ductus deferens, that's going to carry sperm towards the urethra. We have some veins, and then we have the testicular artery, which comes down here too. So if you remember that the testes form in one place and then move, basically this is its cord, the cord that attaches the testes to where it began in the body at the posterior abdominal wall. So we have this kind of long tether, and in that tether we have the nerve, the artery, and the veins, as well as the path for the sperm from testes to urethra. So we call all those things together because they're wrapped in a kind of sheath. That's the spermatic cord. So like on this side, this is the spermatic cord. It just is still wrapped in its cremaster muscle, right? So here it's been opened so we can see what's inside it. All right. The scrotum is divided, so it has a septum in between, and the raphe is just the part of the septum you can see from the outside, from the external part. All right. And I think that's all. Okay. So then if we look into the scrotum, now we can start to see some of the internal structure of the gonads, the testes. And the testes are all about coiled ducts. So a duct is just a small tube, right? And you can take a flexible tube, think like a garden hose that's very flexible, and you can coil it all up, and you can cram a very long tube into a very small space, right? Well, that's pretty much the anatomical organization of the testes. Long tubules that are all coiled up so that they can exist in a very small space. All right, so what we're looking at here, here's our section. So we're looking through sort of a cross-section of the testes. So this is the testes right here. And the testes is divided into compartments. So you can see, like, here's one and here's one. Those compartments, we call those lobules. And each lobule is full of coiled ducts. And the ducts that are found there are called the seminiferous tubules. There's 2 or 3 in each of these compartments, in each of these lobules. And it's in the seminiferous tubules that sperm production occurs. So the site of gamete formation in the male is in the seminiferous tubules of the testes, right? So that's where sperm are produced. Again, more on that in a minute. We're doing the anatomy first, and then we'll go look a little at the physiology of it. So each of these compartments is attached to the epididymis, which is right here, by a series of ducts that are not so coiled, that are more straight. This is the epididymis, another long coiled duct. And in this case, the epididymis is just one long coiled duct. So Here we have 2 or 3, 2 or 3, 2 or 3, but here in the epididymis, it's just one long duct. And the epididymis is where sperm is stored. So they're created in the testes, and they're stored in the epididymis, which means they must have a path from one to the other. And that is what this region is. The rete testis, which is right here, is a series of ducts that connect the seminiferous tubules with the epididymis. And the final exit, so to speak, from the testes is the efferent ductule. So you see how there's 1, 2, 3 ductules here, 1, 2, 3 here. Those are the efferent ductules. That's how sperm gets out of the testes where it was made. Okay, so rete, testis, seminiferous tubules, lobules, epididymis. And as you'll see, this isn't a very good picture of the epididymis because it actually, let's see if we can find it. Do you see, here's the epididymis here. So it's a great big long thing that kind of clings to the back of the testes, but in cross-section, we only see a tiny little part of it. All right. All right. So, gametogenesis. A gamete, like I said, is another name for that is a germ cell. You may have heard it described like that in biology classes. But a gamete is, the short version is, it's a sperm or an egg in the human being. But generally speaking in biology, plants have gametes too. So a gamete is a cell that contains half of the normal genetic material. So if you have 2 cells that have half and you put them together, you get a whole, right? But the whole you get is different than either original cell. That's the whole basis of genetics and evolution, is that 2 organisms create an offspring. Their gametes come together, but the offspring is not identical to either parent, right? So it's through this process that we actually get that to happen, that we get the stuff of evolution and inheritance. So gametogenesis has a special kind of cell division associated with it, and that is meiosis. Now, you all learned in high school biology about mitosis, right? M-I-T, that's where cells divide. Well, unfortunately, the name for the special kind of cell division sounds very much alike. So be sure you don't confuse those words. Mitosis is what's happening in your body everywhere all the time. Cell division, right? Meiosis, with an EI, is the kind of cell division that results in egg or sperm, right? And by no means do I want you memorizing or learning all the steps here. I just want you to know that mitosis is regular cell division. Meiosis gives birth to gametes. Okay, so that's one thing I want you to know. The difference between these 2 processes is in the number of chromosomes that result. In mitosis, so normally in a human being, we have 46 chromosomes. We have 23 pairs, right? So if we have 23 and each one is a pair, that's 46 total, right? So in mitosis, we have a cell with 46 chromosomes that divides into 2 cells with 46 chromosomes. So there's no loss, right? They're essentially identical. In meiosis, we go from 46 to 23. So we have, instead of 23 pairs, after meiosis, in a gamete, we have 23 chromosomes. So we have 1 of each. If you think of pairs of shoes, if you have 23 pairs of shoes and you take 1 shoe from each type, that's what's in a gamete, because there's just 1 of each pair. Yeah?
Okay, so mitosis, you have 23 pairs, and meiosis, you have 23.
23. Yes, you got it. So, you've got 1 shoe from each pair of shoes, so to speak, in your gametes. And then in mitosis, we have 1 cell that becomes 2. In the steps of meiosis, we have 1 cell that becomes 4. So that's another difference. Mitosis is 1 to 2, meiosis is 1 to 4. So then those 4 cells are technically gametes because they have only half the chromosome material of a normal cell. So there's special words to describe that. 46, in other words, every chromosome is paired. We call that diploid or diploid. Di is 2, ploid is number of chromosomes, right? So that's a normal body cell, is diploid, 23 pairs of chromosomes. The gamete we call haploid, or half the number of chromosomes. So we have 23 in a haploid cell, or 46 in a diploid cell. Now, without getting into a lot of genetics, the reason for this is, what we want to do is we want to take 2 gametes from, father and mother and put them together and have a cell that has 46 chromosomes. So if we're going to do that, we have to reduce the number of chromosomes in each cell by a half. Because we want, for evolution's sake, we want traits of the male and traits of the female to be able to mix, which means that we have to cut out half the chromosomes so we can add half from the other organism, right? All right. Okay. So in the male, gametogenesis, the final result are going to be spermatozoa. So a spermatozoon, that's the singular. A spermatozoa is many, right? So it's a little funny language thing. So the process of creating sperm is called spermatogenesis, and it takes place in the seminiferous tubules. Here again, I'm not interested in you knowing all of the stuff on this picture. It's too detailed. So know that spermatogenesis creates sperm. That's the process. It occurs in the seminiferous tubules, and it involves meiosis, which results in haploid cells. Now, this last change down here, I do want you to pay attention to, though. So, because of meiosis, we get 4 gametes, 4 haploid cells, right? But they don't look anything like a spermatozoa. We call these spermatids. And spermatids, they have the right genetic material, but they haven't become sperm yet. They haven't become spermatozoa yet. So the process by which spermatids become spermatozoa is called spermiogenesis, which is essential. So spermatogenesis creates the cells. Spermiogenesis takes these cells and then makes them into the sperm that we recognize from our biology classes, right? So the spermatids get remodeled, essentially, into the spermatozoa, even though the chromosome numbers and things like that don't change. So this is that last step. So spermiogenesis takes about 5 weeks to complete. So for a spermatid to become one of these recognizable guys down here takes about 5 weeks, and that occurs, again, in the seminiferous tubules, as we'll talk about in a minute. All right. So spermatozoa, spermatozoon for singular, is essentially, it evolved for a simple purpose, and that's to carry the genetic payload to the egg cell, to the ova. The egg cell doesn't have very far to travel to get from ovary to uterus. The spermatozoa does have a long way to travel. It has to go all the way up through the female reproductive tract. So it evolved to be light, mobile, and efficient. Okay, so at the tip here, we have what's called the acrosome or the acrosomal cap. The ova, after ovulation, has a protective covering around it. And in order for a sperm to get into the ova cell, into that cell membrane, it has to eat its way through or digest its way through this protective outer covering. And the acrosome, which is up here at the tip, it has enzymes that do just that, that eat the protective covering of the ova. All right, so that's at the top. The head, it contains the genetic material, and it's become very compact. When we started as a spermatid here, the genetic material was kind of spread out. But in the process of spermiogenesis, as the sperm form, that genetic material gets very compact, right? So it's almost solid. So that's the head. We have the neck, which just connects the head with the rest of it. The neck. The middle piece is kind of the engine of the spermatozoa. It's got a whole bunch of mitochondria surrounding the beginnings, the core of what comes out as the tail. So tons of mitochondria create the ATP that's then going to make this tail wag to cause the swimming motion. And then we have the tail or flagellum, which flaps kind of like you'd think it, just like you think it would. So of importance is note that there's no energy source here. There's mitochondria. Mitochondria can create ATP if there's oxygen around. Mitochondria can create ATP, but only from something else. There's nothing to burn. So, how if there's an engine, but there's no gas tank, so to speak. And that is accommodated for because the sperm are mixed with secretions from several of the glands, and one of those secretions contains fructose, which is a sugar that the mitochondria can use to create ATP. So there's no fuel source on the inside, but in the semen that this spermatozoa is going to be in, it will be surrounded by fuel that it can use to burn to create ATP and make the swimming happen. All right. So where do those guys come from? Well, they come from the seminiferous tubules. So, here is our cut through the scrotum. So here's the testes with its lobules. Each lobule has, so this is a lobule here, has a long coiled duct in it, 2 or 3 of them, seminiferous tubules. So when you look at these under the microscope, they look all mixed up because they're all coiled up. If you took a coiled up thing and cut across it, you'd get this mixed up looking thing. But they are actually long ducts. You can sort of stretch them out and you can see that. So then if we zoom way in, each of these circles that we see is a duct in cross section, right? So we've taken a tube and we've cut it long ways. And we have, this is the site of, so these are the seminiferous tubules, and this is where spermatogenesis and spermiogenesis occur. So the simple version is the spermatogenesis, the creation of spermatids, happens at the outside of the tube, right? So here's the outermost wall. Just inside that, this layer right here, that's where the spermatids are being formed. And then as you move closer and closer to the lumen, to the empty part in the middle, the sperm are becoming more and more mature. Okay, so they begin as spermatids on the outside, and then their maturation process moves them closer and closer to the middle. When they're mature, they're released, and then they don't swim. They're actually pushed by fluid into the epididymis for storage, right? So, like in this one right here, what you're seeing there are all the tails. So, a classic picture of the seminiferous tubule is it looks sort of like this in cross section, and then you have all these tails that point towards the center, because as they mature, their tails point inward. So you can't see it very good on this screen, but in your slides, if you look at this bottom one, you can sort of see that the tails are sort of all sticking in together. Okay. Some additional anatomy here. Okay, so we have spaces that are not inside the tubules, right? So this is a seminiferous tubule, but then we have like this region right here, and here, and here, and here. So the spaces in between the tubules, we call those the interstitial spaces. And in those interstitial spaces are cells that produce testosterone. So the testis is the site of testosterone production in the male. And the cells that do that, this is important for you to know, because this is a testable question, so please underline and highlight. Where does the testosterone come from? The interstitial cells of the testes. So these cells that are found in between the seminiferous tubules. Their older name, which people will still call them, are Leydig cells. So Leydig cells are interstitial cells. Interstitial cells produce testosterone. And then, of course, testosterone plays 2 major roles. One is without testosterone, spermiogenesis doesn't happen. In other words, sperm don't mature. So that's the reproductive necessity for testosterone. But then the other piece is testosterone is what creates the male secondary sexual characteristics. So things like, difference in muscle mass, lower voice, height, larger bones, things like that. So, for women, it's estrogen and progesterone that create those effects. For men, it's testosterone principally. All right, so interstitial cells. Okay. So if we look at the seminiferous tubules in sort of a diagram view, you can see the details a little bit better. All right, so here's seminiferous tubule. Here's some interstitial cells, right? So just inside the outermost or wall, this first layer, that's where the spermatids are going to be forming, right? And then as we move closer to the lumen, we have more and more mature sperm. So here you can see, tails are starting to stick out. They're starting to be mature. Sperm need help in developing. They are very simple cells, and the male reproductive strategy is to make huge numbers of gametes. The female makes just one gamete a month. The male makes millions and millions a day, right? So we have two very different methodologies. So if the sperm is that simple that it can be produced in huge amounts, it needs help maturing. And the cells that help the spermatid become a spermatozoa are called nurse cells. So like in our picture, you see these blue guys, right? And you see these dark ones. And then there's all this purple stuff. All that purple stuff are the nurse cells. So when you look at this under the microscope, it looks like the spermatozoa are inside the nurse cells. They're not really. The nurse cells are just wrapped around them. So it looks that way, but they're not inside. They're passing next to, but it's very hard to see the space. So like this is a nucleus for a nurse cell that's all this purple stuff. Here's another nurse cell, all this purple stuff. So the spermatozoa mature right next to these nurse cells. And in the past, these were called Sertoli cells, the nurse cells were. Let's see, so like if we zoom in, all this purple stuff is all nurse cell cytoplasm. And here's a nucleus, and then here's maturing spermatids coming out here. Right. Okay, so sperm are made in the seminiferous tubules. They're stored in the epididymis. But they're not really ready yet. In order to swim well and be able to fertilize an egg, they have to be what's called capacitated. So capacitation is the process by which sperm actually become fertile and mobile. So this was discovered in work with in vitro fertilization, where you take an egg from a donor or from a patient, sperm from a donor or a patient, and you put them together in a petri dish, so to speak, and then you take the cell that results and implant it. Well, what they found is it wasn't as simple as just taking sperm out of the testes and ova out of the ovary and putting them together. So there are all these subtleties that have been learned, in the process of trying to help overcome infertility in patients, and this is one of them. So in order to be fertile, we have to have this capacitation. That is brought about by these other organs of the male reproductive tract. Okay, so what are we looking at? This is sort of a weird view because it's not supposed to be anatomical, it's supposed to be sort of conceptual. All right, so here's the urinary bladder, right? Here's the ureters coming down from above. Here's the ductus deferens. So they're coming in from the testis, right? So they're coming from the epididymis. The epididymis carries or stores the sperm, and then the ductus deferens carry them towards the urethra. So what comes out here and here are mostly spermatozoa, right? Not much else, spermatozoa, a little bit of fluid. In order to be activated, so to speak, the spermatozoa have to be capacitated. So we have these different glands. So the seminal gland, which is right here, it releases fluid into the ejaculatory duct, right along next to the ductus deferens, and the seminal gland's fluid contains fructose, and lots of it. So now there's gas for the engine. Remember, in the middle piece of the sperm, there were all those mitochondria. But they can't do anything because there's no gas in the tank, so to speak. So the ejaculatory duct adds sugar. That sugar gets metabolized, and now there's ATP for that tail to start moving. So that's one addition of secretions. And then the prostate gland, which is right here, it also contributes a secretion, and its secretion is very alkaline. The environment of the vagina is very acidic. So in order for the sperm to be fertile and motile, that pH has to be raised. And that's what the secretion of the prostate gland does. So that too helps increase fertility. And then finally, the bulbourethral glands, which are found near the tip of the penis, they also contribute some final activating factors that sort of give the sperm a pep talk, so to speak, and get them swimming and going on their way out. So we have sperm all by themselves can't do anything, so we have to have these contributions of these other glands to make fertility happen. Okay. All right. So the penis, very simple part of the system, evolved to deposit semen, which contains sperm, those secretions we talked about, near the cervical os, which we'll talk more about when we get to the female system. But the cervical opening or cervical os is the path for sperm to get to the egg, which is usually found in the fallopian tube at fertilization. All right, but very simple. It's basically 3 cylinders, 2 on the top, 1 on the bottom. And these cylinders are made of erectile tissue. So erectile tissue, it's kind of a hydraulic system. If more blood goes in than comes out, it expands. And if less blood goes in than comes out, it contracts. So we have basically 3 cylinders, 2 at the top, 1 at the bottom. And right through the center of the 2 at the top is an artery that supplies the blood that fills these cylinders. And then at the center of the lower cylinder, we have the urethra. So, we saw the urethra coming out of the bladder. The urethra comes along the bottom of the penis and then out the external urethral orifice. So surrounding that is the corpus spongiosum, and then the 2 cylinders at the top are the corpus cavernosa. One of them is a corpora cavernosum, so 2 of them are corpora cavernosa, right? And okay. Skin surrounding. There's veins at the top. There's nerves that run right along the top aspect of it. And then an important thing, which this book doesn't have a very good picture of it, but these cylinders, particularly these 2, the corpora cavernosum, they extend deep to the pubic symphysis as well. So that erectile tissue is not just in the external part of the penis, but it's actually inside, underneath the bones there too. All right, like I mentioned there. Okay, so this view you'll see in lots of different textbooks because it shows all the pieces sort of at once. Even though anatomically this is not giving you a very good picture. The first couple of pictures we looked at are better there, but it has all the parts, right? So here's the testes down here. Here's the epididymis, sort of lying on top. That's where sperm are stored. Sperm are made in here. The ductus deferens connects the epididymis with the ejaculatory duct, which is right here. So they come up and down. The seminal glands contribute their fructose-rich fluid. The prostate gland contributes its alkaline fluid. And then the bulbourethral gland stimulates or triggers sperm activation, right? So a good sort of review. Here's the corpus spongiosum surrounding the urethra, so that's along the bottom aspect of the penis. Here's the corpus cavernosum along the top and sides, and then we have what we call the root of the penis, which is the part you can't see. It's underneath the skin there. All right. So a difference between male and female is, for the male, the urethra from prostate gland to the external orifice is shared between the reproductive systems and the urinary systems, which means that for the male, those two things, in terms of disease, one can cause problems with the other. So, for example, if you have an infection in the testes, it can cause an infection in the bladder because they're sharing a pathway, right? Reverse is also true. If a male has a bladder infection or a urethral infection, then when the urethra is being used by the reproductive system, it can cause pain there too. So you just have to remember that the urethra in the male is a shared organ between the reproductive and urinary systems. All right, so what about some hormones? The reproductive system in both the male and the female is under hormonal control. And what's interesting is the same two hormones are playing a role, they're just playing different roles. So women have luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone, and so do men, but they do different things. And in the female hormones get more attention because they go through this elaborate, change every 28 days. Where the male hormones, we don't really know if they change, but typically we think of them as sort of constant, consistent hormones. There's not a long-term pattern like you see in the female. So we're talking about pituitary hormones. And as we learned in our very first chapter together this semester, the pituitary is under the control of the hypothalamus, right? So ultimately, the hormones that affect the gonads, affect the reproductive system, are triggered by this hormone called GnRH. So gonadotropin-releasing hormone. So the hypothalamus creates that, and in response to GnRH, the pituitary makes LH and FSH. LH is luteinizing hormone, FSH is follicle-stimulating hormone. Now, they get their names from what they do in the female. Okay, so the names will make more sense after we've talked about the female system, which we'll do next time. But for now, it's luteinizing hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, and they do different things, but both affect the testes. So luteinizing hormone stimulates the production of testosterone by those interstitial cells, right? By the Leydig cells that exist in between the seminiferous tubules. So LH triggers testosterone release, and then testosterone inhibits GnRH, which inhibits LH, which keeps this in balance all the time. So why doesn't testosterone ever get too high, or in the normal, why doesn't it get too high? Because it inhibits the factor that triggers its release. So it's a classic feedback mechanism. Well, what does testosterone do? It does all kinds of stuff. There are effects on the central nervous system. So, both limbic system effects as well as cognitive effects. Testosterone is an anabolic hormone. In other words, it stimulates bone and muscle development. The male secondary sexual characteristics, like we talked about, and then testosterone is important for the maintenance of the accessory glands that we talked about. So like the urethra, or not the urethra, the seminal glands, the bulbourethral, the prostate gland, they don't work right if testosterone levels aren't normal, okay? And then your book doesn't really talk about it, but testosterone is also necessary to get from spermatid to spermatozoa. So without testosterone, no mature sperm are made. So it is an important hormone for that reason. All right, so that's LH, testosterone, what testosterone does. What about FSH? Well, we're going to see in the female that FSH is what triggers the formation of gametes, specifically ovum. And in the male, it does the same thing. So follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates nerve cells to create spermatozoa. So you have to have FSH to be making sperm. Just like you have to have FSH to be making or developing an ovum in the female, same exact thing. So FSH stimulates the nerve cells. The nerve cells produce mature spermatozoa. And then there's also this androgen binding protein, but you can draw an X through that because I'm not going to ask you about that. And ultimately, the nerve cells control the release of FSH through this hormone called inhibin. All right, so male reproductive hormones. Wait till you see the female one; it's much, much worse, much more complicated. All right, so let's do some questions and call it a day. Spermatogenesis occurs in which of those places? Anybody not played? I got 7. Oh, you're okay.
Oh, I wasn't on here.
Oh, all right. That's why when it says there's 7 people in the class. Okay, so best answer B. Seminiferous tubules of the testes. So that's where sperm are made. They're stored in the epididymis. They get from testes to epididymis through that rete testis. They are carried from epididymis to urethra by the vas deferens. Leydig cells make testosterone. Sertoli cells are nurse cells that help the sperm to mature. Okay. The spermatic cord is which of those things? Don't forget to do your homework. All right, jump in there, last portion. All right, good. Why did we got that? That's B. So the spermatic cord is the cord that attaches to the testes, and it contains all the stuff going in and out of the testes. So you have blood vessels, lymphatics, nerves, and then the ductus deferens that are coming out towards the urethra. All right. The nurse cells of the seminiferous tubules do all of the following except that they what? Which of those things don't they do? All right, 5 seconds. Okay, best answer B. They don't secrete testosterone because that's what the Leydig cells or the interstitial cells do. All right? Okay, I'll see you all on Friday, and we'll start in on